Hello ladies and gentlemen, it's the Historical Gamer once again, and today I'm going to be doing a book review, or at least a discussion about a book. I'm not so much a formal reviewist, so much as just kind of summarizing some of what this book talks about and my own thoughts on the book. Before I do that, the video that you're looking at in the background, I believe, is B-17 Flying Fortress The Mighty Eighth, which is an old classic. I think it was a Microprose game, which allowed you to play as a B-17 crew member, pilot, or what have you, and fly through a 25-mission tour, or also allowed you to take on the role of a squadron commander where you would choose your targets. It's an absolutely fantastic game, if you don't mind me saying so, and it is available on Steam, although it hasn't aged terribly well in terms of the visuals. The game is still phenomenal. Have some issues getting things mapped out properly with the controllers. So with that being said, again, there are some limitations with the game being so old. But it's still, in my opinion, the best B-17 game out there. I wish someone would redo it with more modern graphics. And to me, more importantly, I would love to see more than 12 bombers in the air at any one time. But that's not the point of this video. I may do an impressions video at a later date for this game. But the real point of this video is looking or talking about a book that I just completed reading. Spoiler alert, it's a very good book in my opinion. I'll get that out of the way. But the book is called Masters of the Air: America's Bomber Boys Who Fought the Air War Against Nazi Germany. And it was written by Donald L. Miller. Looks like, according to the Amazon product page, the book was released in September of 2017. Good Lord, that's in the future. It was released in September of 2007, and it does exactly what the title would make you think. It takes a look at principally the United States Army Air Force, because at that time the Air Force was not its own standalone force. Takes a look at the United States Army Air Force's 8th Air Force. So the 8th Air Force was the famous Air Force that flew out from England, flew the 4-engine heavy bombers, B-17s and B-24s, and struck back against Nazi-occupied Europe and Nazi Germany itself. The book does detail other air forces as well. It talks briefly and vaguely about the tactical air forces, and it also talks briefly about the 15th Air Force, which was the heavy bomber force, a much smaller force based out of the Mediterranean, operating out of North Africa and later Italy. The book is a all-encompassing look at the American side of the air war in Europe. It does occasionally take a look at what the British were doing as well, but for the most part it is really focusing on the American air campaign, with a few times where it delves into the British, kind of contrasting the American campaign against the British. It is a rather long read. It's 688 pages, but in that length is tremendous quality. The book starts out with talking about the development of the bomber mythology, or at least the pre-World War II idea that heavily armored bombers could defend themselves all the way from their takeoff point to their target and back, and be able to operate effectively. Additionally, it talks about kind of the bomber mafia mentality, that the bomber was capable of winning the war by itself, that you didn't need massive armies invading Europe and taking back land. You could simply win the war in the air, and obviously that turned out to be false. And it also, more interestingly, I would say, delves into the actual history of the 8th Air Force in Europe. So just kind of going over what the book looks at. It starts out first talking about kind of the origins of the heavy bomber, talks about the Billy Mitchell and sort of his exploits. And then it goes into the development of the B-17 and how at the time that was a remarkably modern aircraft. It doesn't focus much on B-24 Liberators, but it does certainly reference a lot of their crews and their experiences as the book goes on. It certainly recognizes that they were a part of the 8th Air Force. However, the B-17 certainly gets the limelight when it comes to the coverage, not just in this book, but in general. So the book starts with this sort of initial background on the bombing idea, the ideology behind the bombing campaign. It briefly talks about the British strategic bombing and how they're bombing at night and how they don't believe that the Americans will be able to bomb in daylight successfully. They'll basically get massacred, or at least that's the thought. And then it goes into the deployment of the 8th Air Force to England, starting in 1942, as it slowly builds up its forces. In the early part of the book, it does a really good job about talking about the incredible difficulty that the bomber pilots and the bomber crews would face operating in an incredibly hostile environment. In fact, the environment in many cases claimed more casualties than German fighters or German flak would. What I mean by that is B-17s and B-24s are up in the skies as they're bombing Europe, and they're flying at over 20,000 feet in unpressurized cabins, often with open windows. The waist gunners would have open windows that would have massive breezes coming in negative 30 or 40 or 50 degree weather. It talks about how sometimes crew members would have electrical suits that would fail, and crew members would freeze or would, have frostbite. It talks about how in the heat of combat from time to time, crew members would panic and they would, they'd take their glove off to try and fix a gun jam, and, the skin would touch the metal on the gun, and then, they'd lose their finger basically because it would rip the skin off, and then they'd get frostbite, and then, they would lose the finger or the hand. It talks about how operating at those altitudes did unusual things to the body, where the intestines would swell up, and with continued exposure to these extreme environments, crew members would face previously unheard of mental and physical problems. And then it talked about the mental strain of the bomber campaign on the pilots and on the crews. And it does all of this within the context of telling the story of the 8th Air Force, from its initial small raids, focusing primarily on France or primarily on U-boats in 1942 and into 1943. And then it talks about the gradual buildup, where the 8th Air Force was starved for crews and materiel, and were losing heavy, not necessarily unsustainable losses, but heavy losses without any replacements. And then it goes into the disastrous Schweinfurt and Regensburg raid in August of 1943. It talks about Ploiești and the B-24 strike against that location. And it details these raids, certain particular raids, in substantial detail, but also details the thinking behind the commanders and kind of what was going on back there. It also does a phenomenal job talking about the raid's impacts on Germany. It focuses heavily on Albert Speer, the minister of Hitler's munitions, and in charge, more or less, of Germany's industry by the time the bombing campaign really got going. It doesn't focus exclusively on all the raids, but it does do a good job of painting a picture of what it was like to be a bomber pilot, as well as painting the grand strategic viewpoint. One of the most interesting things I think you can get out of the book is it talks about the gradual shift in American bomber ideology. So, when you go first into World War II, the British have this area bombing, this terror bombing. Basically, let's just wipe out cities and that'll destroy German morale. With the Americans, for certain reasons, it even comes into morals and principles, where the Americans say, listen, no, we're not just going to terrorize civilians, we're not going to kill all Germans, we're going to focus our attacks on certain factories. We're going to target these industries and these factories, and we're going to wipe them out with precision. We're not going to attack civilians, and that's what we are going to do. And to do this, we have to start bombing in the daytime. And it talks about that gradual shift. So, first of all, that the idea of precision bombing in 1942 is a little bit of a joke, but it makes a good point that at least the motives should matter somewhat. So, you hit a house, but you weren't trying to kill the house. I guess you could say it was a difference between manslaughter and premeditated murder. The sentences are different in the courts, so theoretically, if we're talking about war, motives do matter. But not just that, the fact is, a lot of times the factories were located in different locations. So often the British would bomb the heart of a city, devastate that, kill tens of thousands of people, but they wouldn't have any impact on the industry, because the industry was in the suburbs. If they had just bombed the industry, then thousands fewer people would have died, and then the industry would have actually been impacted. It does talk about how, often the Americans overestimated the effect of their bombing. But some interesting components that this book really brought out is it talked about sort of the gradual shift from the U.S. precision bombing to a more area bombing approach. So, for example, in 1942 and 43, the Americans would only bomb when they could see the target, for the most part. That meant if it was overcast, if it was cloudy, they'd divert to another target, and if they still couldn't get a good read on the target, then they, in some cases, would turn around with bombs still on their planes. However, that changed as the war went on. The American bombers started getting these navigational radars that would allow them to see the location of cities in rough geographic locations. What that meant was when it was cloudy, they would start bombing through overcast, as the Air Force politely put it. But these radars are not very accurate, and that basically meant they were bombing blind. They were blind bombing, and you're going to kill a lot more innocent civilians when you do that. And then so you go from the shift of, no, we're only going to bomb when we can see the target during daylight in good weather, with our Norden bomb sites, and sure, we'll kill some civilians here and there, but that's not the intent, to we're going to bomb through cloud cover via really inaccurate radars, to by 1945 you've got the Americans participating not to the same scale as the British. They only did it a couple of times, but in 1945 the Americans bombed the heart of Berlin with over 1,300 planes. As the Russians were approaching Berlin, the Americans intentionally targeted railroads and railroad stations that they knew were packed full of refugees. The argument was it would hinder German resupply and transport of troops to the east, and that may be true, but it was a very different shift. Whereas before that, the Americans had principally been bombing marshalling yards, which are kind of like massive train parks, but not the actual stations. Additionally, the Americans participated in Dresden, although at least there the argument was made they were hitting the marshalling yards, and they didn't actually play a role in the firestorm there that occurred, although they did bomb it the next day, and certainly some refugees that were trying to flee the city were hit because the Americans were hitting the rail yards after the city was burned out. In fact, the book does an interesting job of explaining kind of the German civilians' perspective at Dresden and how it felt to the Germans. The night of the bombing of Dresden, the British hit this section of the city and set it alight, and then as individuals fled to a different part of the city, a historic district that they thought was secure and safe and that the British wouldn't bomb because of its history, then the British bombed that and set that alight. And then the next day, those same people, the survivors of that, fled to the rail stations to try and get out of the city, and then they were bombed by the Americans. So certainly the Americans were not free from blame, although they were not directly trying to start firestorms. However, it's worth mentioning that, interestingly, as you go later and later into the war, the percentage of incendiary weapons that are on U.S. bombers continually increased. The book talked about how the Americans attempted to control the PR campaign from the perspective of, no, we're not bombing civilians, we're bombing targets, we're bombing industrial targets, and they had a pretty aggressive campaign to try and deflect any attention away from them as having killing civilians. Interestingly, despite the fact that as the war progressed, the actual results from the bombers changed greatly. One thing that I think is worth mentioning as well throughout this book is that I think perhaps the greatest quality of this book is the way that it's written. It really jumps off the page at you. You really hear, you have a sense of emotion. I mentioned earlier kind of the tolls that were placed on bomber pilots and bomber crews, and it has a moment where it screams to you just the emotion involved in this conflict. It talks about how a bomber was coming down and a ball turret gunner was stuck in the turret. The turret was jammed. He couldn't get out of it, and the landing gear wouldn't drop on the bomber. So if the bomber would land, he would be crushed. He's trapped in this, and the first thing that's going to come down is the ball turret, and without landing gear, it's going to get crushed against the concrete of the runway. And he talks about how the pilot and the turret gunner and the ground control are all talking for 5, 6, 7 minutes. The ball turret gunner knows what's going to happen, and they're discussing, what to do and what's going to happen as the plane is getting ready to land, and it's a powerful moment. As well as I'll talk about in a minute or so, as well as the moments where he's talking about the German perceptions of the city bombing and the area bombing that was going on there, and the firestorms, and it screams to you. There's some moments where it's talking about POWs, prisoners of war, transferring from facility to facility, or about a bomber rear turret gunner in a B-17 whose propeller ripped off and cut the plane more or less in two, so that the tail was severed from the body of the plane, and it went into an uncontrollable spiral, and the rest of the crew couldn't get out and was killed. But this tail gunner punches out the plexiglass in his tail and kind of wiggles his way out, and just when he thinks he's stuck, he flies out. But he knows he's dead because he doesn't have a parachute, and somehow he survives and hits the ground, and witnesses seconds later the rest of his crew dying in a fireball as the rest of the plane slams to the ground a half a mile from his location. And this book just does an amazing job of communicating the emotion and the experience that these crew members went through. It was not by any means a book that focuses on the ordinary person, in a sense. A lot of history has gone that direction, where they focus almost exclusively on the ordinary sailor, the ordinary pilot, at the expense of understanding the bigger picture. This book didn't do that, but it selectively targeted quotes and experiences and stories to include, so that you could get that vibe, you could get that emotion, you could get that understanding, while at the same time still hearing the bigger picture. And where this book really shines is its description of its characters involved, be it Jimmy Doolittle in charge of the mighty 8th Air Force, or Rosie Rosenthal piloting a B-17 on the way to Germany. One other thing I'd be remiss to say, or if I didn't say, is also one of the things that you have to factor in when you talk about the U.S. precision bombing, is when the war started, the U.S. was bombing largely in formations of 100 or 200 bombers, so the formation was relatively small. And thanks to Curtis LeMay, the U.S. decided to implement a bomb-on-the-leader tactic, where a bomber would drop, the lead flight in the formation would drop, and all the other bombers would drop on his command. But the problem with that, basically as soon as you see the bombs in the lead bomber go down, everyone else starts dropping their bombs. The problem with that makes you more accurate in the short term if you've got your best bombardier on it, but it makes you much less accurate if you factor in the way the formations grew. Average raid size is increasing from 200 bombers to 900 bombers, and now you've got a 10-mile long bomber train. One of the quotes of one of the pilots was actually something along the lines of, the lead planes clobbered the target, but the rest of the planes behind it destroyed the town. So there's the other sort of myth of precision bombing in this era and the tactics that were utilized. It's like, you're hitting the target, but you've got such a massive formation hitting that target that by the time the end bombers are dropping, they're, clobbering something totally unintentional. In all honesty, this is a fantastic book. It was fascinating and really all-encompassing. Again, it talks about the human element. It talks about the commander's element back home. It has numerous first-hand accounts of pilots and their experiences on certain raids. And it tells a more or less chronological story from beginning to end, from the initial early days of just trying to figure out how the heck you're going to bomb from 24,000 feet to with electric suits that only 3 or 4 people in the crew have and fail half the time, to 1945 when things are very different. It tells the story of a bomber crew member who flew on over 50 missions, Rosie Rosenthal, 52 missions, and even toward the end of the war, he was shot down, suspected dead, and he actually bailed out and was rescued by Russian soldiers. It also talks about how the American bombing campaign actually directly made a shift, and the British as well, to try and help the Russian invasion from the east. It talks about the Battle of the Bulge and how the Americans thought that it was a horrible omen and that it meant the Germans had a ton of fight left in them and they were, going to put up significant resistance. And with that in mind, as the Russians approached Germany in 1945, the American bombing campaign switched to directly trying to aid Russian military advances. And that's where Dresden came in, because Dresden was a rail hub of the German eastern cities. So the Americans began participating in attacks on Berlin, on Leipzig, on Dresden, on all the major rail centers in eastern Germany to cut the flow of supply and reinforcements to German frontline forces so that once the Russian attack began, the Germans would be unable to bring up reserves and additional ammunition. The book also talks about how the Americans stumbled, accidentally, into a war-winning strategy. So for a long time, the Americans were bombing different industries and having somewhat limited effect. But then the Americans started bombing the rail networks. And that's key because I think a lot of times you hear about the German industry during World War II being somewhat unaffected by the bombing campaign. You hear, oh my goodness, strategic bombing was not successful. It was such a waste of effort. So many people died and to so little purpose. And that's not really true. It was certainly true in 1943. But even when the Americans bombed the ball bearing works at Schweinfurt, Albert Speer, which again, some of his testimony needs to be taken with a grain of salt, but Albert Speer of Nazi Germany came out and said, listen, if the Americans had hit Schweinfurt multiple times with follow-up raids, it could have caused a cascade in our economy. However, they didn't do that, and it allowed them to repair things relatively quickly. One interesting piece is that despite the supposed failure of the Schweinfurt raid, the Germans did lose 30 to 40 pilots, and it was in many ways viewed as a Pyrrhic victory on the German side. It's like, yeah, you shot down 70 bombers or 60 bombers and killed or wounded or captured more than 600 men. However, with that being said, you were losing pilots you couldn't replace. And Germany's air industry at the time of these raids was not set up for mass production in the way that the Americans were, so they were at a severe disadvantage. Additionally, the Me-262 had several key parts, several manufacturing pieces that were at Schweinfurt, and they were damaged, and that actually delayed the arrival of Germany's first jet fighter. In fact, in reading this book, I was struck in many ways how similar the German Air Force's plight was to the Japanese Air Force in World War II. The Germans did a better job of training new crews and using experienced pilots to train new pilots, but the German air arm was not set up to need to rapidly replace massive losses of pilots. So the Germans went through a similar situation where in 1943, when they're rising up to meet the American bomber formations, they're doing pretty well. And even when they engage in American fighters, they can do okay. But as the war goes on, the quality of the crews rapidly decreases, and you start to see turkey shoots taking place and shortages of airframes. The German industrial complex, the air industry, and the Air Force training specifically was not set up in the same way that the Americans were to take massive losses and be able to replace pilots. And in many ways, again, it reminded me of sort of the Japanese experience in World War II, where you have this elite group of cadres that form the backbone of a elite air arm, but once they go away, once they start dying, then you have a very serious problem. Where was I going with what I was talking about earlier? The book details kind of the V2 raids and the development of that. It talks about the fighter command and how it went from close escort of bombers to more roaming attacks on the Germans. It certainly asks some kind of key questions. So it details in absolutely stunning horror the British attack on Hamburg in 1942, which I think is interesting because you always hear about Dresden when you hear about the horrific area bombing and how it was maybe morally dubious. You never hear about Hamburg. And I think that's because Dresden happened toward the end of the war, and it was a city full of refugees. But Hamburg may have actually killed more people, and it was the first time that a bombing force was able to create a firestorm. Basically, these whirlwinds of fire in a city that were superheating the air. The air in the city got so hot that people could catch fire as they're running through the streets. Their shoes would melt into the asphalt. The asphalt was so hot. The fires were so intense they would suck all the oxygen out of the bomb shelters. Just an absolutely horrific scene. And Hamburg, at least according to this book, may have resulted in over 10,000 more casualties than Dresden did. And the chapter on Hamburg, I will also add, was phenomenally well written. This book in general is well written, but when I was reading that chapter, it was so powerful and emotional that it really sent. In all honesty, I read a lot of books about a lot of war, and a lot of times reading about a conflict and death and what's going on, you kind of get desensitized to it a little bit. Shame to admit it because you really shouldn't, but it does happen. But I will say, as I was reading through the chapter not Dresden, the chapter on Hamburg, it sent chills down my spine. Just the way that it described the horror of the firebombing there it was a very powerful chapter, and I would recommend the book on that chapter alone, even though the focus isn't on the British, and that was a British raid. But yeah, that is about as graphic and powerful you can get when you're talking about the firebombing of Dresden, at least in anything that I've looked at, and I've looked at a fair bit. And rarely gets talked about. But that's not really the point of this video. Again, the point is just to talk about this book covers a wide range of topics within the bombing campaign in World War II. And I have never seen a book in this much detail or this thorough that really does justice to the air war. And so I highly recommend it. I have a lot of notes here, and I kind of got a bit off topic. I'm rambling somewhat, and I'm not going in any kind of coherent orders, so I apologize for that. But I can't really say enough positive things about this book. I don't review a ton of books, and frankly, I don't review a ton of games. I'm certainly not a critic per se, at least not by my own definition. So it's hard for me to say buy this or don't buy this, or here are the really bad things about a book I really love. So keep that in mind. I'm obviously coming with a very pro perspective of this book, but it's hard for me to point out any negatives. I did a book review of Ghost Fleet maybe it was a year ago now, which was a kind of a Tom Clancy-like modern-day thriller which looks at a hypothetical war between the United States and China in the near future. And while I loved the concept, and while I thought the book was fascinating, I had a lot of reservations about it and a lot of critiques about it. I was very critical of the book itself. The concept was phenomenal, and I could see the potential. And with this book, I don't see the potential beyond what is here. And I mean that in a good way. What I mean is that the book that is here, to me, seems like the epitome of what you could do with a book on the 8th Air Force in World War II. If you really want to be a stickler, you could probably say they could include a better explanation of sort of the process of the war, when things were happening, maybe more detail about certain raids, maybe more detail about how certain campaigns like the Big Week or other major bombing efforts were affecting Germany specifically because of that raid. But even if you did that, I'm not sure what additional benefit you would get from it. I don't think it would quantitatively change the quality of this book. So with that being said, I think I'm going to cut the interview short here. I'm sure there are things I'm missing out, but in short, this is a phenomenal book, which I highly recommend. I have included a link in the description to this book. I will make you all aware that that link is an affiliate link. So if you click on it, you go to Amazon and you buy it via Audible, via Amazon itself, I will get a very small cut of that. That's not why I'm doing this review. I didn't get paid anything to do the review. I just figured if I'm doing the review, I should probably provide a link to the book. And since I am an Amazon affiliate, I might as well throw my own Amazon affiliate link in there. But if you don't, if this isn't something that's your cup of tea, doesn't seem interesting to you, I don't recommend it, then don't buy it. But if you are interested in the air war in World War II, if you are interested in the 8th Air Force, if you're interested in the bombing campaign, specifically the Daylight campaign, I just can't recommend this book enough. This is a masterpiece, in my opinion. I'm a big Shelby Foote fan. I know his writing has a lot of flaws in it. However, not from a technical standpoint, but just the history in it has some flaws in it. But there's no doubt in my mind that his 3-volume history of the American Civil War is the most all-encompassing, well-written, compelling, and interesting series on the American Civil War. And while it does have some historical faults in it, on the whole, it is a phenomenal work. And I would really put this in the same vein. I wouldn't say the writer has quite the same gift outside of a few areas. I will, maybe I take that back a bit, because when he's talking about the bombing of Hamburg, or when he's talking about the experiences that the crews are going in there, it is phenomenal. It is moving. So maybe I'll take that back. But I do feel like this is a great book for anyone interested in the topic, and I highly recommend it. And that's about all I have to say about it. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Let me know what your thoughts are. This turned into more of a summary than it did a review, but that's just because I honestly can't find anything to say. Here's a critique of the book. I know they're out there. I'm sure they are. A professional critic would be able to find them. And I don't pretend to be a professional critic. And I don't do a ton of reviews either, so take that as it is. This is more of a summary of the book and kind of talking about it, but if it is something that's interesting to you, check it out. I also think there's an HBO series that's being made about this as well. I know they're making a Bomber Boys HBO series with Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg directing. It'll be like Band of Brothers, but in the 8th Air Force during World War II. And I think they're using this book largely as a guide for the series, so it should be interesting to see. But anyway, guys, I'm starting to ramble now, so I'm going to go ahead and cut the video off here. I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And until next time, this is the Historical Gamer saying thank you for watching, and I'm out.